This scripture on Nicodemus is one I'm sure many of you have heard before. Actually, I'd even preached on it back in March of 2017. And it's interesting to me, though, how different words and thoughts popped up for me this time. I'm sure in many ways that's the same for you. As we go through different experiences, our views and our thoughts change. Our experiences offer wisdom and sometimes humility about what we once thought and what we now understand. This past 18 months or so has definitely offered a time to reflect and discern many things we thought and took for granted. It also offered time to discern the makeup of this country, seeing racism rise in ways that were up close, personal, and heart-wrenching. Understanding the plight of people of color, recognizing and acknowledging the land we live on as Indigenous land, the need for gun control, and for a better understanding of what mental illness is and how we can be part of the conversation to help others understand. So many things to learn more about beyond the ways we were taught. Our focus this morning is on Nicodemus, a Pharisee and a leader of the people who comes to Jesus at night. The reference to Nicodemus coming to Jesus at night could be seen as a symbolic reference to unbelief or to the wrong kind of belief. Like Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus was a secret disciple of Jesus, and so he came to Jesus at night. Nighttime was a time for studying the Torah and for theological dialogue. Nicodemus acknowledges Jesus as rabbi and comes to him at night for a theological discussion. Given the negative connotations of darkness in this gospel, it is most likely that the night refers here to unbelief or spiritual misunderstanding. According to Marcus Ford, he explains that John's rich symbolic use of language refers to night, meaning that Nicodemus is still in the dark. And Nicodemus has come to speak with Jesus to learn more about this teacher who has come from God, who could only perform such signs and wonders by the power of God. Nicodemus struggles with the idea of being born again or born from above. As a literist, you see, he struggles with the idea of being reborn from the womb and the actual possibility of this. This part of the scripture is something I hold as a beautiful metaphor. This scripture continues to offer me an image of radical transformation, not an actual rebirth from the womb as Nicodemus struggles with, but transformation of the heart, transformation of the soul and of our spirit. It made me think of the blind man whose sight was restored. I think of this as a transformation of seeing things differently. I think about Paul before his conversion, then known as Saul, who was a zealous Pharisee who intensely persecuted the followers of Jesus. The book of Acts tells us that Paul was on his way from Jerusalem to Syrian Damascus with a mandate issued by the high priest to seek out and arrest the followers of Jesus, with the intention of returning them to Jerusalem as prisoners for questioning and possible execution. The journey is interrupted when Paul sees a blinding light and communicates directly with a divine voice. He changes the direction of his life, giving up everything he thought was giving him security, power, and meaning, and he experiences a radical transformation, a rebirth that opens him to abundant love and compassion for others. Being born again for Paul describes a transformation from hate to love, born into a different way of thinking, a different way of seeing. And for me, as I reflected on this scripture, I had a different way of thinking, a different way of seeing, of understanding, as these words jumped out at me when Jesus answers Nicodemus, "Are you a teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things?" This made me wonder How many times are we taught something by someone who possibly does not understand the implication of what they're teaching? Do we teach without understanding? Now, this really hit me hard when I thought about, say, Thanksgiving. What I had been taught all through school and what I participated in teaching while working at Fresno Unified, I also participated in the telling of the Thanksgiving story that I now understand as a controversial holiday among Indigenous people, as some completely disregarded protests against this holiday for its dark history. And many don't celebrate Thanksgiving because of the United States' history of discrimination, violence, genocide, and cruel policies against Indigenous people. Like many of you, I was taught in elementary school that Thanksgiving is a peaceful holiday that originated when the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Indians gathered for a meal together during the cool Plymouth evening of 1620. I wasn't taught about the events that followed after Thanksgiving, the Trail of Tears, the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, and the removal of Indigenous children who were then forced to assimilate into white American culture in boarding schools. I also wasn't taught about how the US government essentially trapped American Indians into poverty on desert and isolated reservations with a lack of resources. These friendly Indians welcomed the Pilgrims to America, taught them how to live in this new place, sat down to dinner with them, and then disappeared. They hand off America to white people so they can create a great nation dedicated to liberty, opportunity, and Christianity for the rest of the world to profit. That's the story. It's about Native people conceding to colonialism. It's bloodless and in many ways an extension of the ideology of manifest destination. According to an op-ed in the New York Times by Robert Tracy McKenzie, a history professor at Wheaton College, quotes, the US still wrestles with challenges of diversity, and we're still tempted to distort the first Thanksgiving into one of two equally present-minded morality tales. The heartwarming multicultural celebration or the cruel reminder of European colonialism, end quote. From an article in November of 2019, Smithsonian Magazine by Claire Bugos, I'm reminded of the Thanksgiving pageants held at schools across the United States, where children dressed as Native Americans with colorful feather-filled headdresses and sit at tables with other children wearing black construction paper hats. It's a tradition that pulls on a history passed down to the generations of what happened in Plymouth. Local Native Americans welcomed the courageous pioneering Pilgrims to a celebratory feast. But as David Silverman writes in his new book, This Land is Their Land, much of that story is a myth riddled with historical inaccuracies. Beyond that, Silverman argues that the telling and retelling of these falsehoods is deeply harmful to the Wampanoag Indians whose lives and society were forever damaged after the English arrived at Plymouth. I'm so proud of our congregation and its acknowledgement at the beginning of each worship service. The land we worship on is Yokut's land, and it is just as important that we share that acknowledgement as well as understand why we are making it. We at Community UCC share the acknowledgement statement to show respect for Indigenous peoples and to recognize their enduring relationship to the land. Practicing acknowledgement can also raise awareness about histories that are often suppressed or forgotten. Another history that needs some light shed on it is our history of slavery, our history of racism, and how that history continues through systemic racism. Over and over again, we see the effects of white privilege and the power over keeping people of color from full and equal life in this country. Again, in schools, we were taught that slavery ended when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. Well, During this past year, we were really handed a first-class seat, a clear view, as the ugly head of racism proclaimed it still very much alive in our country and in our states and in our communities. We watched a horrific crime of a white police officer kill a black man on our television screens and our social media arenas. As far as I know, we don't teach about white privilege and white supremacy in schools, and I wonder if we should. I wonder if we should be teaching what Black Lives Matter, that it means when people hear or counter with all lives matter, they will understand that when Black Lives Matter, then all lives will matter. Black Lives Matter is a slogan and a social movement in response to racism and violence perpetrated against Black people, both historically and in the modern era. The Black Lives Matter movement began in July of 2013 as a hashtag after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting of then teen Trayvon Martin in February of 2012. The Black Lives Matter movement became nationally recognized after the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner in 2014. Street demonstrations and protests against police brutality in Ferguson, Missouri, and New York created a national awareness. Black Lives Matter's activists demonstrated against the deaths of way too many African Americans by police actions or by the things that happened while in police custody. Last year, on May 25th, as we acknowledged this first anniversary, the movement returned to national headlines as we heard and watched the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. It is estimated that anywhere between 15 and 26 million people participated in the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, which center on criminal justice reform. All Lives Matter was born out of Black Lives Matter. It's sad to me that people need to counter Black Lives Matter because of their inability or their naivete to understand what is meant by Black Lives Matter, and that it does not mean other lives do not matter. So what does it mean to say all lives matter? It means that some people interpret the slogan Black Lives Matter as confrontational and divisive. They believe that Black Lives Matter excludes other races and all lives matter evolved as a response, supposedly to argue that all lives are equal and as we are all human beings. But if we're to understand and learn what Black Lives Matter actually means, that it was not a phrase used to mean that other lives do not matter. But in our country, our states, our communities, where people of color are still discriminated against, marginalized, and stigmatized, the slogan, the social movement, was simply to acknowledge that Black lives matter too. Our church had Black Lives Matter on its sign because we, as a faith community, understand what this means. We have book groups and discussions to help us understand our own racism, our own white privilege. When we respond to Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter, it disrupts our conversations about racism against Black people. It denies the problems of racism and shuts down the discussions and the importance of what is happening and what we are doing to change it. We need to understand that through its use, All Lives Matter has become associated with white supremacy, far-right nationalism, and racism. I can only imagine asking Jesus, why don't we just say all lives matter? Because you care about all people. And Jesus responding with, have you not learned and taught about my life? And yet you do not understand these things? This brings me to the last part, the misunderstanding of mental illness. We as a church are working toward becoming a wise church. We've been watching short videos at the end of our services these past couple Sundays, and we will see one again today, as May is Mental Health Awareness Month. There are so many myths about mental illness that continue to perpetrate due to the lack of understanding and knowledge. We may have learned about mental illness as children to fear those who seem different to ourselves, instead of having age-appropriate healthy conversations that are needed in that moment. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of shame attached to mental health conditions, with much of this relying on old-fashioned thinking and outdated assumptions. As with many things in life, the more information we are armed with, the less likely we are to allow myths to become our realities. Not that long ago, society excluded people with mental health conditions. Some people believed that evil spirits or divine retribution were responsible for mental illness. Although this way of thinking has been removed from society in much of the world, it still casts its long shadow today. Many folks may feel that mental illness does not affect them, but the fact is more people than you realize are affected by mental health. Just in my family alone, I have a nephew who has bipolar, and has it has a it has had a huge effect on my brother and his wife and our family and him, um, as we work together to help him see that he needs his medication to live in a more healthy and easier life. But it's hard because it's hard on him. It's hard on him when he doesn't want to take the meds because he's feeling uncomfortable, or it makes him feel different, or he's been feeling good for so long he feels like he doesn't need it anymore. These are just hard things, and these are things that we live with. But we also know that he is our family, and we love him, and we want the best for him. Mental health, such as depression, which is high in young people, affects many, many, many college-age students and high school students. And in the US, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death, as suicide from mental illness is more than double than that of lives due to homicide. Children can also experience mental health issues showing first signs before the age of 14, as 75% of mental health disorders begin before the age of 24. And with all the mass shootings and violence this past year, people quickly assumed it's due to mental illness, when in fact, most people with mental health problems are not more likely to be violent than anyone else. Actually, people with severe mental illness are over 10 times more likely to be victims of a violent crime than the general population. They are also more likely to hurt themselves. You probably know someone with a mental health problem and don't even realize it. Because many people with mental health problems are highly active and productive members of our community. There is so much more to know about mental health, so many myths that need to be obliterated, allowing the facts to be our guides. But that is our job, isn't it? To learn. As we move into 2021, we need to be aware that the mental health of the world has taken a beating, and we need to ask the questions, if even in the middle of the night, to understand about mental health, to become wise so that we can become helpful friends to those we know and those we welcome into our church, our homes, and our community. Though Nicodemus may not have understood what Jesus was explaining to him, he continued to question. And isn't that how we learn? Isn't that the way we begin to understand from our still speaking God? Nicodemus's legalistic mindset won't let him accept the ideas that Jesus is teaching. So Jesus puts a hole in his self-image. In Greek, Jesus refers to Nicodemus as the teacher of the Jews. Nicodemus must have been a particularly knowledgeable man, and he certainly studied the Old Testament in depth. But there's a large difference between what we believe we know and understanding the truth. In this moment, the most loving thing Jesus did for Nicodemus was to tell him that he was not perfect. His understanding and teaching was not matching up with his current learning of who Jesus was. But Nicodemus sought out Jesus, honestly seeking answers in the cover of night. I believe we can all be changed by Jesus's metaphor of being born again. We have the opportunity of transformation, the ability to see and understand things differently. We can learn how to acknowledge the myths and falsehoods and live into truth of who we need to be. We can learn the histories of people of our lands, indigenous people, and acknowledge them by name. We can participate in race and racism studies and book groups that help us understand white privilege, white supremacy, and systemic racism, and how we can participate in the changes that need to happen now. We can learn to let go of myths that keep us from becoming wise as we continue our journey into learning more about mental health. May we seek to reckon with the mystery and power of the God whom we worship and who calls us into new life and service. Our world likes easy answers and superficial sound bites. However, the call to follow Jesus is one that brings us into something deeper and more difficult. This challenge is one that is not to be taken lightly, as it offers us a greater adventure and a more meaningful life. So as we seek to question, learn, and share our wisdom, may we always begin with the teachings of Jesus, who taught us how to love, how to live, and to care for our neighbor, whoever